All right, well, I will get started. Welcome everyone to California's second annual Biodiversity Week. My name is Andrea Jones. I'm the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, California. I'm thrilled that we have over 700 people joining us today to celebrate the biodiversity of California. I want to first thank the California Department of Natural Resources, as they are the ultimate host of a series of events going on all week to celebrate California's biodiversity. If you go to the California Department of Natural Resources website, you can find out what other events are going on around the state. For Audubon, we are hosting 2 events this week, as well as encouraging everyone to go out and catalog birds in their backyards and beyond. And the second event will be at noon on Thursday, and that will be discussing the intersection of nature, access, equity, and biodiversity with a bunch of our staff. So what we have going on today is we're going to do a flyover through a story map, which is an online GIS map that we'll share with the link with you at the end. We're going to do a flyover of some of the key places in California where Audubon California is working on protecting biodiversity. And that includes, we'll have 4 different staff talking about the work. And I'm just going to kick it off by telling you all what biodiversity is. Biodiversity refers to the life in a particular place, and it's usually measured through the number of species. So that's what biodiversity is, and why are we celebrating it in California? We're celebrating in California because of our incredible biodiversity, and in 2018, Governor Jerry Brown signed the Biodiversity Initiative into California and designated September 7th as the official Biodiversity Day. And his goal was to make sure that in future planning and protection efforts across California, we incorporated biodiversity planning into our work and looked at things through the lens of biodiversity and climate change. And you can scroll forward, Giselle, thanks. So California is we're really lucky to live here and or visit here. I know some of you are from out of state. California has the highest number of species of any state in the United States. And we have the highest number of endemic species, and endemic means those species that are found in a specific location and nowhere else. We also, unfortunately, have the most rare and imperiled species, with 30% California species threatened with extinction. And I think this is the reason Governor Jerry Brown and the current administration want to keep on this focus of preserving the biodiversity of California, because we're already at risk of losing 30%. We've been designated one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots across the globe, and my colleague Sandy DeSimone will talk to you more about the hotspots coming up. And I just want to give you a background on Audubon's work and what we're going to talk to you about today. Audubon California does not work everywhere in California. We focus our work in a few different geographies. And those geographies are our centers that you can see on this map. And again, we'll put the link to this map in towards the end of the presentation. We work in urban landscapes, particularly in San Francisco Bay and Los Angeles, but also in Fresno and Sacramento and Bakersfield. We have a program in the Central Valley you'll hear about today. You'll hear about our desert work, and you'll hear about our coast and marine work as well. So just a very brief summary of the work Audubon does in California. And when I say Audubon, I mean Audubon California, and I'll talk about our chapters in a minute. We work along our coasts, and we work along our coasts in partnership with our chapters, passing funding for habitat restoration, protecting key estuaries, and protecting key estuary habitats like eelgrass, and making sure our coastline is going to be resilient to climate change in the future. We work in the incredible Central Valley, and you'll hear more about that from Matt coming up. Our recent wins are, we work to make sure there's water on the landscape for birds, and we work on natural climate solutions on working lands. And working lands mean those places where we have agriculture and a lot of United States produce happening. So a combination of working to protect habitats on farms and also on ranches. In desert, we work on ensuring that renewable energy projects are located in places where they have the least impact to birds, but also help us reach our renewable energy goals for the state of California. And we work in particular in places like Salton Sea, and we'll talk to you more about that coming up. And last but not least, we work in the urban environment, both in San Francisco and Los Angeles out of the Richardson Bay Audubon Center and the Audubon Center at Debs Park. And at these places, our work is really community-based. We don't just work at the centers, but we work throughout the communities on education and environmental practices such as restoration. And we'll hear more about that from Tanya. And our work in California is in part so successful because of our chapters. There are 49 chapters in California, more than any other state in the United States. And each one is independent, but we are partner organizations, so we all work together. Each chapter does raise its own funds, and the chapters are organized into regional councils where they work in specific regions on common conservation and policy issues. Chapters are a critical part of our conservation advocacy and our campaign work. And I should mention, we don't just work with chapters, we work more and more with community-based organizations in the places we work in addition to chapters. So the chapters are a big part of what we do, especially in helping us pass policy. And each year we host a really fun event in May in Sacramento to advocate for the policies we want to pass. And this is a picture from 2019. With that, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Sandy DeSimone, to talk about biodiversity in Southern California.
I'm Sandy DeSimone. I direct research and education at Audubon Star Ranch in Southern California. South Coastal California is a biodiversity hotspot of global importance. Hotspots are areas harboring the greatest concentration of living species, especially those found nowhere else in the world. Concentrating conservation efforts in hotspots, which are relatively small areas, gains the greatest biodiversity value from limited conservation funds. Most Southern Californians remain unaware that a globally significant ecological jewel lies near the heart of their region, a relatively intact and functioning ecosystem that rates as a global hotspot of biological diversity and conservation value. Coastal Southern California lies in the heart of the Mediterranean climate region in California. The Mediterranean climate is semi-arid and limited to 5 regions worldwide, seen in pink on the map. The Mediterranean climate is characterized by dry summers and low average rainfall, which is limited to the cooler winter months. The South Coast ecoregion in tan on the map lies south and west of the Southern California mountain ranges along the Pacific coast and is a hotspot of biodiversity. This ecoregion supports more endemic, as Andrea mentioned, that means found only in this ecoregion, plant and animal species, and more imperiled species than any other ecoregion in the US. South Orange County lies in the heart of this biodiversity hotspot, and Audubon Star Ranch, where I live and work, is located in South Orange County. Coastal sage scrub, a shrubland, is a globally endangered habitat type and is arguably the most endangered habitat in the US, with more than 85% of its original area lost to agriculture and urbanization. It's the dominant native plant community at lower elevations in coastal Southern California. Star Ranch protects and restores over 2,000 acres of some of the last remaining coastal sage scrub in Southern California. The worldwide distribution of coastal sage scrub lies in a narrow disjunct coastal strip in Southern California and northwestern Baja California. In the map, you can see the US extent of southern coastal sage scrub in pink. The southern limit of coastal sage scrub is near El Rosario in Baja California at about 30 degrees north latitude and coincides with the southern extent of the Mediterranean type climate in North America and the transition to more arid desert conditions. Within California, coastal sage scrub is a high conservation priority, providing habitat for over 100 plant and animal species currently considered threatened, endangered, or of special conservation concern. Coastal sage scrub has a greater concentration of rare species than any other California ecosystem. The coastal California gnatcatcher or gnatcatcher is a tiny gray bird with a tiny range and was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1992, after which it became an umbrella species for conservation of its habitat, coastal sage scrub. Audubon, California garnered the vast grassroots network to help successfully overcome attempts by the building industry of America to delist the gnatcatcher. The gnatcatcher's song sounds like a cat. They pick insects from sagebrush and other shrubs and never seem to slow down. Their kitten-like harsh meow often comes from deep inside a shrub, although males sometimes call from exposed perches while flicking their tail. Coastal California gnatcatchers are monogamous and maintain pair bonds and territories year-round. Males chase intruding males and juveniles out of their territory, but often tolerate lone females. Female brown-headed cowbirds often lay an egg in the nests of gnatcatchers. The gnatcatcher eggs are either kicked out by the cowbird or are smothered by the much larger cowbird nestling. Parasitized nests very rarely fledge gnatcatcher young. The worldwide range of the gnatcatcher closely tracks the distribution of coastal sage scrub in coastal Southern California and northwestern Baja California, from southern Ventura and San Bernardino counties south to approximately El Rosario, Mexico at about 30 degrees north latitude. Sometimes called the canary in Southern California's proverbial coal mine, the coastal California gnatcatcher is a prime indicator of ecosystem health of the coastal sage scrub. Coastal cactus wrens are distributed in Southern California coastal cactus scrub habitat from Ventura County south to northwest Baja California. Some consider cactus scrub a subtype of coastal sage scrub. Cactus is an essential component of the cactus wren's habitat. It's a spiny fortress, largely safe from predators, where wrens build nests and raise young. These birds share song characteristics and have a similar ecology, but are isolated from desert populations, supporting designation as a distinct subpopulation. Coastal cactus wrens are a non-migratory bird species unique to Southern California, and their populations across the region have declined drastically in the last 20 years. The coastal cactus wren is currently listed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife as a California state species of special concern. Without conservation action, the subpopulation of this species will likely be extirpated from the region. Loss of their cactus scrub habitat due to development, extended drought, and wildfires, coupled with their short distance fledgling dispersal, is driving declines of these birds. Wren populations are squeezed into ever smaller and widely separated patches of habitat, supporting only limited numbers of wrens. Hamar will speak next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hamar Lim. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Richardson Bay Audubon Center and Sanctuary, located in Marin, California, which is right on the north side of the San Francisco Bay Area. Before I start talking about the coasts, a question from Andrea for all of you is, how many bird species do you think have been recorded in California? Go ahead and type those answers into the chat and we will reveal the answer at the end. So, California coasts. Here we have a map of the state of California highlighting what we have designated as important bird areas, but here are some quick facts. It's 3,427 miles long and contains about 68% of the state population. So this is a really important thing because not only are humans attracted to this very sort of productive area and desirable area to be, so are birds. And it's a very integral part of the migration route that we call the Pacific Flyway, and it extends all the way from Alaska down to Chile. It's particularly, you can see around San Francisco, there's a very large important bird area right on the map, and San Francisco Bay is actually the largest estuary on the West Coast, and at the peak of migration season, millions of birds at a time can be resting in that bay. And the picture on the lower right is a photo taken of elegant terns during migration season in Richardson Bay. So I'm going to go ahead and give you an overview of some different zones characterized by certain birds. So let's think about this as a visit to the beach. And when you start off at the beach, you're at the shoreline, and one of the birds that inhabits the shoreline is the western snowy plover. So this really small bird nests on the ground, and the eggs and nests can be very, very hard to see. Normally, this is a good thing for the plover because the camouflage sort of lets it hide from predators that would otherwise eat the eggs. But when we're sharing the space with the birds, or when they're sharing between birds and humans, this can be very bad for it because humans can go ahead and walk around and step on the eggs without seeing them. So despite being able to raise 2 to 3 broods per year and having the oldest recorded snowy plover live up to 15 years old, their population is listed as threatened and is in decline. So contributing to that is increased development along the coast and also just habitat disturbance, like people walking around. So one of the things that Audubon does to protect birds like the snowy plover is we work with our chapter network to do a lot of public education and put up symbolic fencing along the coastline. And that photo you can see in the center there is a photo that, or it has a sign that was put up to educate the public and let them know, please respect the fence, don't walk up behind it and potentially crush the eggs, and also the different sort of plants that live there. And we can hear the snowy plover call right here. All right, so now we're moving from the beach down into the intertidal zone. So as you're walking along the sand, the intertidal zone is the area that the tide will cover and at high tide, and then at low tide when it recedes, it leaves exposed. And this is a very, very productive area for birds like the black oyster catcher to be able to find food. So the black oyster catcher primarily hunts mollusks and other creatures that live in this intertidal zone. And it's very dependent on the sort of ecosystem that exists there. There are seaweeds like the sea palm, which support different species on that intertidal zone. You can see in the photo to the right how many things sort of grow on those rocks, and all sorts of different things are really important there. So one of the cool facts about the black oyster catcher is that they're often seen in pairs, and they're thought to be monogamous. And we manage an island at Richardson Bay Audubon Center called the Rambaroo Island. And the photo on the bottom left is actually a photo of a pair of black oyster catchers that we have seen nesting there for the past several years. One other thing about black oyster catchers and their sort of sensitivities is that Similar to the plovers, they nest on the ground, so protecting shorelines and making sure people don't trample around them is important to protect their eggs. Another thing is that since they eat mollusks, which are filter feeders, the water quality is really important to protecting them because, as you can imagine, if there are pollutants in the water and the mussels or oysters that filter feed that water are processing those pollutants, that can accumulate in them and then be eaten by the oyster catchers. So let's go ahead and listen to the black oyster catcher's call. Okay. And now finally, we're going to move from the intertidal zone into the water. And the species that highlights our waterfowl for this presentation is the brown pelican. So I'm sure many of you have seen brown pelicans and have seen them dive into the water and catch fish. It's really cool. They swallow entire fish whole. And one interesting thing that I recently learned is that gulls can be seen sometimes diving and trying to steal fish right from out of the bill of a pelican, and the drawing on the right illustrates that. And that's a phenomena called kleptoparasitism. Now, brown pelicans can live up to 43 years old, and that's very important because when you think about a bird that lives for that long and primarily consumes fish, that's a lot of potential for accumulation. So what that's called is bioaccumulation. And this is really important to the sort of conservation history of the brown pelican. So populations up until relatively recently were very much in decline and near extinction until the substance called DDT was banned. And the reason that happened is you have this substance washing down, it's a pesticide, and it washes into the water supply. And there are all sorts of different little macroinvertebrates and things like that that can get covered by DDT, and those get eaten by the fish. And then the pelican eats the fish. So there's this process of magnification that is happening and collecting DDT within the body of the brown pelican. And when that happens, it was found to have an effect of softening the eggshells of the pelicans. So when they would sit on their eggs to keep them warm, they would actually break the eggs because the shells got very thin. And this wasn't only affecting the pelicans, it was also affecting osprey and eagles. But very, very fortunately, the DDT was banned, and the brown pelican populations have gone right back up. But still, it is very sensitive to water pollution. And also it's very sensitive to overfishing. So maintaining the food supply of the brown pelican is very important. And one of the things that Audubon has done is we've worked with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, CDFW, to do a sort of herring management plan to sustain herring populations. And we also sustain eelgrass, which is this aquatic plant that grows in estuaries like the San Francisco Bay, which serve as a very effective nursery habitat for fish. So let's go ahead and listen to the brown pelican. Okay, and with that, I will hand it over to Matt to talk about work in California Central Valley.
Thanks, Hamar. Thanks everyone for having me today. My name is Matt Allshouse. I'm the Conservation Ranching Program Manager here in California. And today I'm here to talk a little bit about the Central Valley, the biodiversity in the Central Valley, and the work that Audubon does here in the Central Valley. Most people probably know that the Central Valley is really diverse, not just from a biological lens, but also from an agricultural, economic, and cultural piece. The Central Valley is a mosaic of agriculture, wetlands, and rangelands that provides habitat for a wide array of different bird species. Just a couple factoids about the Central Valley. 1/3 of all the precipitation that falls here in California drains into the Central Valley. So the actual valley itself is about 20,000 square miles, which is roughly 14% of the land area in the state. So it's about 400 miles long and 50 miles wide. One of the interesting things about it is that 1/4 of all of the food within the country comes from the Central Valley. On top of that, it contains some of the most fertile land here in California and in the nation. It's a very prominent valley. You know, it can be seen from space, and it's this huge valley that has amazing soils that were created from the runoff and sedimentation from the mountains around it, from different volcanic eruptions, as well as from these massive salmon runs that came into the valley. So it creates this amazing place for agriculture. Over 250 different crops are raised here in the Central Valley, but it's also home to 6.5 million people and has the fastest growing population within the state of California. On top of that, it's also used by a lot of different migratory bird species coming through the Pacific Flyway, including over 6 million ducks and geese every year and over 1 million shorebirds. So it's second only to the Great Salt Lake as far as an interior site that is important to migratory bird species. Here in the Central Valley, Audubon has their working lands team that represents one of the best hopes for conservation, because our working lands team works with agriculture and producers and different water districts to find the best management plans, not just for water and agriculture, but for the wildlands within the Central Valley. So we help develop these market-based solutions to build economic incentives for industry and landowners to do bird-friendly practices on their lands. Some of the other folks here in the working lands group work with rice growers to leave water on their farms that benefits not only shorebirds and waterfowl, but salmon in the rivers, as well as several other programs, including the one I'm about to talk about, which is the Conservation Ranching Program. So the Conservation Ranching Program is a national program through Audubon that started in the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains to sort of curb the loss in grassland bird populations. Over the past 50 years, grassland birds, well, birds have been declining throughout North America, and the largest group or population of birds that's declined has been grassland bird species. So over 50% of grassland birds have disappeared in the past 50 years. For me, it's kind of hard to wrap my head around that number. For grassland birds, it's around 720 million birds that have disappeared. And if anyone's ever been out in the grassland, one of the most iconic birds that you see around is the meadowlark. And they're fairly common. But to contextualize that loss in population, that's about 3 out of every 4 meadowlarks. So if you go out and you see a meadowlark, there used to be 3 times that many meadowlarks at any given location. So the Conservation Ranching Program was developed to create this market-based incentive for ranchers to do bird-friendly practices on their land, not just for specific biodiversity for birds and other wildlife, but also for other ecosystem services like soil health, water retention, water quality, plant species biodiversity. A recent article was published that showed grasslands are more resistant and resilient carbon sinks for climate change. So in our pilot program here in California, associated with conservation ranching, we develop habitat management plans for each particular grazing property and then put them through this certification program. As part of that, Audubon has their Bobcat Ranch, which is here in the Central Valley, located just west of Davis, California. And Bobcat Ranch is kind of a hotspot for biodiversity. It has several different ecosystems on the ranch, including annual and perennial grasslands, blue oak woodlands, savanna and chaparral, as well as some riparian areas. This provides a lot of habitat for a variety of different bird species. So you can see more at the Bobcat website if you'd like to. In this figure below, you can see the different ecosystems here on Bobcat Ranch. The darker brown is the chaparral. The blue is sort of the blue oak woodland and savanna with grasslands intermixed, as well as some montane hardwood forests. So below I've listed some iconic species, and I would love to list a bunch of different grassland species here, but I've picked two in particular because I think they represent the area well. The first one is the American Kestrel. So the American Kestrel is one of the most common falcons here in North America, as well as one of the most widespread. They're usually pretty easy to identify just based on their color, their size, and the way that they fly. They're obligate cavity nesters, but they're also obligate or opportunistic grassland foragers. So kestrels, although pretty common, their populations have declined by over 51% in the past 50 years. So they rely upon these places for food and foraging. One neat fact about the kestrel is, like most birds, they can see ultraviolet light, and they use that to mark the trails of urine of voles and highlight ways to meals. Part of the conservation ranching program is identifying these different focal species that utilize areas and then coming up with management recommendations to maintain healthy and diverse populations. So two of the considerations that we make for the kestrel is to maintain a healthy herbaceous layer, so different types of forage on the ground that supports these rodent and insect populations that they use for prey. The other one is retaining these trees since they're obligate cavity nesters like mature oaks and cottonwoods. The next bird that I'd like to highlight is also a pretty common bird, but I think it's one of the coolest birds that we see. So it's the acorn woodpecker. The acorn woodpecker utilizes these oak savannas, and they're also obligate cavity nesters. Their breeding behavior is really complex and complicated, with multiple males and females combining efforts to raise different young in a single nest. So acorn woodpeckers populations are pretty stable, but the reason I chose them is because they're an ecosystem indicator. So populations of acorn woodpeckers can be used to determine the health of a particular ecosystem. So their populations are actually declining in most areas because these endangered blue oak woodlands are also declining. One cool thing about the acorn woodpecker is that one of the longest running ornithological studies has been going on since 1968 to study their social dynamics and social behavior. So things that we do on Bobcat Ranch as far as management considerations around grazing for the acorn woodpecker is to retain and restore these acorn producing oaks, mostly blue oaks, but also valley oaks and coastal live oaks. And then retain these granary trees in which they store their acorns for the year, and they use them as shelter as well as cavity trees for nesting. So just a little inside information on two birds of particular interest for our program. And with that, I'd like to send it off to Tanya to talk a little bit about the things Audubon's doing in different urban landscapes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya. I am the program coordinator here at Audubon Center at Debs Park, located in Northeast Los Angeles. And I will be chatting about the Los Angeles River. So a little bit about the Los Angeles River. It's 51 miles long and actually runs across the whole county of Los Angeles. It starts in the San Fernando Valley and ends in the port of Long Beach, as illustrated here in this picture. It was actually once a pristine wild river. However, in 1938, there was a terrible flood and most of the river was widened and channelized with concrete slabs and bottoms, and is actually one of our main watersheds now. With that channelization, it was estimated that 95% of riparian and wetland habitat was lost. Despite these alterations, however, the Los Angeles River actually still sustains a wide amount of birds annually, especially migratory birds. So it's very suitable habitat. The Los Angeles River can be broken down into two main parts, as illustrated in the next slide. we can go ahead and list them as the upper and lower Los Angeles River. Both, once again, sustain a wide array of birds, but the habitat looks very different for each type. So in the upper Los Angeles River, we can go ahead and pull out that picture, Giselle. The river is not fully channelized. What that means is that we have the concrete side slabs, as you can tell within that image, but the bottom is not channelized. So there's no concrete on the bottom. It's considered a soft bottom. So it's overall dirt. So this allows for riparian habitat and plants overall to grow in the middle of that river. And this habitat really sustains some of our migratory songbirds, like our warblers, but also our wading birds or diving ducks, like our hooded merganser and mallards, etc. The lower Los Angeles River is quite different because it's all channelized. And once again, Giselle will pull up an image. In this Los Angeles River, you have your concrete slabs on the sides, but also the bottom is all concrete. So nothing can really grow in the lower Los Angeles River. No, there really isn't going to be plants in the middle or any trees or anything like that. However, surprisingly, these concrete slabs really allow our migratory shorebirds to be able to thrive in this urban Los Angeles. So in this area of the river, every year about 15,000 birds pay this area a visit on a daily basis. All these are shorebirds for the most part. So what happens is that in these summer months, during migration season, there's a thin layer of treated water that will fill these concrete channels, like in the image illustrated, that really provides an optimal condition for algae to be able to grow. And with the growing of algae, we also have microinvertebrates. And this is the main food source for a lot of shorebirds. So these microinvertebrates are really what's able to sustain these shorebirds in their migration journey from South America to Alaska or vice versa. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So due to the immense habitat loss of the Los Angeles River, the Audubon Center at Debs Park adopted 5 pocket parks to be able to create more habitat that's adjacent to this river. These pocket parks are all within that upper Los Angeles River portion, and they're really meant to support our bird species, but also educate our community. So this map illustrates those 5 pocket parks, and I want to go ahead and transition a little bit to talk about Rio de Los Angeles State Park and how specifically this urban park is sustaining one of the endangered birds of the Leesville's vireo. So here in Rio de Los Angeles State Park, it is listed as a California state park overall here within Los Angeles. It is located in Northeast Los Angeles, so 5 miles from Debs Park, and it's also adjacent to the Los Angeles River. This park is really interesting because as you can tell with the image, it is a very urban park. By what I mean with that is that it has a lot of active recreation. So things like your baseball courts, right? Your basketball courts, your tennis, your soccer fields, you have your children's playground, right? So it's what an urban park typically looks like, right? It's a park that's meant for recreational use that's really supporting people. But aside from all that active recreation, you also have the passive recreation. You have a bioswale. You have an area, a trail area that you can go ahead and walk around. And that significant portion also provides ample habitat that is really able to support our wildlife. So within this park, this last summer, we were able to spot 7 leaf-spilled vireo during the summer months. Now, what are leaf-spilled vireos? So these birds are small gray. They're slightly bigger than a warbler. You cannot really see them unless you hear them first. And the leaf-spilled vireo is a subspecies of the Bell's vireo. So it's a subspecies of another species, and that their range is limited to Southern California and Baja California. They're short distance migrants. So what that means is that Baja California is their wintering ground, and then Southern California is their breeding ground. Okay, in comparison to other birds that have a way longer migration route. It is listed as endangered due to riparian habitat loss for the most part, that is very similar to the Los Angeles River. So it actually once extended all the way to Northern California. However, due to habitat loss, most of the range now when it comes to SoCal is limited up to Santa Barbara County. Aside from habitat loss, they're also susceptible to cowbird parasitism, which is the same thing that Sandy explained at Star Ranch with the California gnatcatcher. These birds are insectivores, and their stopover habitat in their migration journey can consist of a wide array of habitats, including riparian, chaparral, woodland, but their breeding habitat is very specific to riparian, which once again is what the Los Angeles River mainly is composed of. Something really cool about the leaf-spilled vireo is that they have such a high breeding site fidelity, meaning that once they decide to nest in a given area, they will come back to that area every year to the same site and even to the same shrub or plant every single year. So once they decide, oh, this is my spot, I will stay there until, they decide otherwise or they think it's a lot more dangerous. No nests have currently been found in Rio de Los Angeles State Park, but if a leaf-spilled vireo nest is found at Rio, it can provide really good insight on how urban environments, specifically our urban parks, can really help our wildlife thrive, but also the importance of our urban waterways to sustain these breeding populations. For now, however, this gives insight on the importance of how a really urban area like Los Angeles that supports 12 million people can really, what they can really do to support our birds as a stopover site to their potential breeding grounds. A little bit more about our habitat enhancement or restoration program is that it's a great importance to our urban environment due to the urban sprawl and habitat loss. Here at the Audubon Center Debs Park, we center our enhancement events around two main goals of restoring native habitat for birds, whether it be riparian next to the Los Angeles River or woodland within our inland parks, but also educating our community on the importance of this work, which we find really be an optimal key to our urban environment. So these events are very hands-on and pretty much give a hands-on learning experience to what people can do in their own backyards, but also on the importance of protecting our biodiversity and what environmental stewardship looks like. With that said, I will now pass it over to Andrea, and she will talk to us a little bit more about the Salton Sea.
Andrea, you're on mute.
Thank you. Hi, I'd like to talk to you about the Salton Sea today. And this program is managed by Frank Ruiz. He's our Salton Sea Program Director, and he will be talking at our Thursday webinar. But this is one of the places myself and some of our other science colleagues work. Scroll forward. The Salton Sea is one of the most biodiverse places in the Pacific Flyway. There's more than 400 bird species. Can you keep scrolling up a little bit, please? Thanks. More than 400 bird species have been recorded at the Salton Sea. It's very close to the Mexico border, and so we get a lot of birds coming up from Mexico as well. It's referred to as a terminal lake, which means it doesn't have an inflow and an outflow. It has water flowing into it from multiple rivers and irrigation canals, but then it dries up somewhat in the summer, and all of the nutrients in it form salts, and the water gets more concentrated. It's very similar to the Great Salt Lake or Mono Lake, for instance. Let's keep going. Why is Audubon working at the Salton Sea? We're working here to provide a sustainable Salton Sea in the future, to provide a robust and diverse suite of habitats and birds, and controlled dust to protect human health. The reason we're working here is because the Salton Sea is shrinking. It's shrinking by about 40% because of water diversions. And so we're working with other NGOs and community-based organizations, as well as with the state of California, to come up with a long-term solution to ensure that the Salton Sea is going to be sustainable for birds and healthy for people in the future. And how do we do our work at the Salton Sea? We do that through a combination of things. And this is how Audubon often works. We don't just work on one thing. We work on science. All of our work is science-based. We're actually gathering data at the Salton Sea on the health of the water and what kinds of invertebrates are available for the birds when they come to feed at the Salton Sea. We work on policy in Sacramento to ensure that there's funding available for the Salton Sea and that we pass policies to protect the water and air in the region. And we work on community engagement and education with the local communities and the high schools in the region to help them learn about the Salton Sea and to give them voices in Sacramento and locally to fight for their sea. And I want to mention a few of the cool birds we see at the Salton Sea. There's 400 and I can't possibly mention them all. One is a northern shoveler. Now this bird just comes for the winter, and we've seen thousands and thousands still coming to the Salton Sea in the winter, particularly around the edges, and their shovel-like bill just scoops along the surface, or they dip their heads down and their butts into the air, and they feed along the bottom and pick out invertebrates out of the mud in the water. And they sort of concentrate around where we have wetlands and water sources coming into the Salton Sea because that's where we get the most nutrients. Eared grebe is my favorite bird of the Salton Sea, and it's one of the birds that really gave us an alarm when we realized so many of them were missing from the Salton Sea. Previous records show that more than 1 million eared grebes pass through the Salton Sea in late winter on their way up to their breeding grounds above the in the prairie pothole region in the interior United States and Canada. And they come to the Salton Sea to feed on invertebrates like pileworms. And as the sea became more salty, this food resource wasn't available anymore. So we saw the number drop from what was millions to literally just hundreds of birds. We now, as this environment has changed, we have a new insect on the scene called the water boatman that the eared grebes love to eat. So we are starting to see a return of some of these birds. But it's important when you think about almost an entire population of a species stops at one place, you need to protect that or that species is in danger. And white pelican, I call the poster bird of the Salton Sea. We've estimated about 30% of their entire population, breeding population, winters at the Salton Sea. A lot of these birds are coming from the Great Salt Lake, and they're here to feed on fish. But as the salt levels have changed, we've lost a lot of the fish at the sea, and we're starting to lose numbers of pelicans. Keep going. And the American avocet is really a bird of the saline lakes, and they breed across the saline lakes in the west. And they get this brown plumage in the summer that I call their lightly toasted marshmallow plumage. And their chicks can walk and swim within 24 hours of hatching. And let's listen to their song. Great, next slide. And what has Audubon been doing at the Salton Sea? Well, in order to determine how much water needs to be much habitat needs to be protected in the future, we quantified how much habitat was available before the sea started to change. And we confirmed about 60,000 acres of habitat were ringing the sea. And we're using that number and the science in it to advocate for this amount of habitat be available in the sea in the future as it changes. Next slide. So I want to run quickly through some of the cool habitats at the Salton Sea. We have the mud flats and shallow water around the edge that are used by shorebirds. And these are areas that are still used by thousands and thousands of shorebirds. In fact, they're migrating through right now. Next slide. We have the mid-depth water used by the dabbling ducks like the shoveler I showed you, or by white pelicans who actually dip their bills into the water versus plunge diving like the brown pelicans do. And we have the deeper water where you could see the brown pelicans, although there are a few of those now because there are fewer fish. And also by the grebes, western grebes and Clark's grebes, and also eared grebes are out in the deeper water diving for fish or invertebrates. Next slide. And ringing the edges, and we're actually seeing an increase in this habitat type, or wetlands. There's over 6,000 acres of wetlands ringing the Salton Sea right now, and they're home to some of the state's rarest birds, including the Ridgway's rail, which is a federally endangered species, and many other species of rails, and things like least bitterns, a lot of ducks, coots, A lot of different species, some songbirds. So these marshlands are very vibrant and rich. Next slide. As I mentioned, the sea is changing, and we're trying to anticipate that change and make sure that the sea is sustainable. 40% of the sea water is disappearing and being sent to other uses in the state. And so that means there's about 40,000 acres of playa or open shoreline being exposed. And because it's a very windy region, that's kicking up massive amounts of dust and causing air quality problems for a region already prone with air quality problems. And that leads to asthma issues and other health concerns. And this is impacting 650,000 people. And what Audubon is doing is if we fix it for birds, we'll fix it for people too, because we'll make sure that this playa, exposed playa and the dust in it is no longer being emitted into the air. While I've given a sort of a bleak picture of the Salton Sea, it's still an incredible place to go birding, especially for the shallow ducks and the shorebirds. And we have a website, and we'll provide a link to this as well as on the story map to showcase the places and where you can actually access the Salton Sea to go birding. And we really encourage people. It's great for ecotourism in the region if people continue to go birding there and see this incredible diversity of bird life. And lastly, before I just wrap up, I want to reveal how many birds are on the official California species checklist. There are 676 bird species confirmed as having been seen in California. Now, not all of those are regularly occurring. Some of those are rarities that are coming up from other places, but the official number is 676. So congratulations to those of you that were close. And if you'd like to help stay involved, you can sign up for action alerts on our policy initiatives. You can find a chapter near you to find out ways to participate in local birding and local advocacy efforts. I've also just put the ArcGIS map, this story map link in the chat, and so you can go on to this later. You can also connect with us through social media. And we really encourage people to use Ebird. This is a online birding website developed by Cornell Lab Ornithology, and it's the world's largest birding database, and it's good for both the casual backyard birder to the more serious birder. It's a great place to enter and keep track of your bird sightings, and that data is available for scientists to track things like how birds are reacting to climate change. So we encourage people to give Ebird a try if you don't already use it. And again, we encourage you to join the Audubon in whichever way you can and get involved in the work that we're doing. I think with that, we're finished. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll invite all attendees, all panelists to join. And Dan, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panel that you've been seeing in this very active chat?
Yeah, there's been lots of questions coming through, so thank you everyone for all the questions. Andrea, I'll ask a couple on the Salton Sea. There's a question, is the Salton Sea shrinking at 40% per year or overall?
That's overall, and so it's predicted in the next 3 years, it will have shrunk by about 40%. So it's in the process of shrinking right now.
Great, thank you for that. And also, how can one volunteer to help with work at Salton Sea?
I would encourage you to go to our website, and there are, once COVID is a little behind us, we'll be having volunteer events at the Salton Sea to help us track the bird populations. You can also go by yourself if it's safe and record your data in Ebird, because we use Ebird to track the bird populations at the Salton Sea. Lastly, getting involved in our policy efforts is really important, because we're constantly advocating for funding to go to the Salton Sea.
Great. Also, there were a lot of questions around birds and wildfire. Specifically, where do birds go during wildfires? Are wildfires driving an increase in species competition for healthy habitats and that sort of thing? If anyone would like to speak on that topic.
Andy, would you like to take that? You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you hear me? Yeah, if there are refugia, if there is habitat left in an area because they can fly, unlike some of our small mammals and other species, they go there. But that's the problem with these huge fires that we're having now. There sometimes isn't any place for them to go. So, I don't know.
And we encourage people to keep habitat in your backyard for birds, especially during the fire season. Keep out water sources. Bird baths are very important, and bird feeders, so that as birds try to get out of the fire areas, they'll have refuge in your neighborhoods. Anyone else have a response to that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrea and Sandy. You know, analyzing areas in the state that do have climate refugia or refugia after these fires can be really important. Also, the ecosystem dynamics behind fire here in California in particular, some lend themselves to creating early seral stage habitat right away, and some don't, especially with invasive species. And so one of the things that we do in our program is have management plans for these invasive annual grasses that come in after fire, so that bird habitat can be there as soon as we get rains afterwards. It'll be interesting to see, and hopefully everyone's ebirding so that we can try to see where populations go and how they're affected. But the fire complexes are pretty large.
Yeah, I think another thing to add just for urban environments, right? It's like also the importance of connectivity, specifically for like our mountains and what that looks like for our urban sprawl, right? And I think Deb's Park specifically, like the pocket parks, if something will be happening in the Los Angeles River, then at least there's some connectivity with the pocket parks or vice versa, right? And I think that is a model that can be further expanded into also continuing to like mountain forest ecosystems.
Great. So just to be mindful of time, we're almost at 1 o'clock. So I think that'll sort of wrap up the Q&A. Andrea, if there's any parting words you'd like to leave us with.
I just want to thank everyone for helping us celebrate California's incredible biodiversity today, and thank all my co-panelists. We had a great turnout, an incredible chat today, and we have all of your emails, so we're going to be sending you all a link to the recording as well as to the story map. And on the story map, you'll be able to get links to all the different programs we've talked about and find out how you can help. So thank you all today, and hope you're able to spend a little time this afternoon getting outside and seeing a few birds.